Today marks the 5-year anniversary of the Atlanta spa shootings. The attack in March of 2021 took the lives of 8 people and became a flashpoint in a national conversation about race and culture, crime, and biases. As our coverage continues, we want to bring in right now Professor Angie Chuang of the University of Colorado Boulder, an associate professor of journalism. Professor, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Obviously, a tough day and a grim milestone here. This shooting, these attacks, tragedy that took place here in Metro Atlanta, that got coverage across the country and across the world as well. Let's start here in 2021, when news of this attack was spreading across the country. What was the impact as people all around the United States found out about this?
I think one thing to remember is that this was still when many places were either locked down or remote. So people were spending a lot of time in their homes. They were, for lack of a better word, sort of doom scrolling about COVID, about the about the Black Lives Matter protests of the summer. And we were experiencing already a wave of anti-Asian American hate. And so this came as a real shock, but it also arrived to an audience of people who were already feeling isolated, already feeling fearful. And so I think this just compounded the feelings that we had coming out of the height of the pandemic about isolation and racial hate.
The accused shooter in this case, Robert Aaron Long, and I use the word accused, he has pleaded guilty to 4 of the killings in this case. He stands trial in a separate trial that he has pleaded not guilty to for the murders of 4 others in this case. Robert Aaron Long has denied that a racial bias was a motivator in the attack. Instead, he said he had a, quote, sexual addiction, and he saw that the businesses that were targets of this attack were a temptation for him that he wanted to eliminate. That's what investigators said at the time. A lot of people at the time, though, outside of the case, had a lot of questions and trepidation about Long's statements on that, and a lot of people saw evidence of a bias here.
I think from day one of this shooting, Stop AAPI Hate was calling for a federal hate crime designation and really lobbied and then ended up protesting for law enforcement officials to name a hate crime. And I think it's really important, particularly with Asian American women and the stereotypes that they've confronted over decades, that race and gender are inseparable in this case, and that this was a shooter who was clearly disturbed, and that often the words that a shooter says upon arrest are not necessarily the reason to designate or not designate a motive for a crime. But certainly, I think we can look at centuries of the oppression and misrepresentation of Asian American women to gather why this may have been a combination of gender and race, which caused the shooter to target women as he had. And he had never patronized these businesses, so this was not a literal like place where he had been that he decided to go shoot at. They were more or less randomly chosen.
And we should point out here once again, 6 of the 8 victims who were killed were women of Asian descent. We're 5 years removed from this attack. The FBI has an online hate crimes database, and from about February of 2021 to February of this year, according to the FBI, close to 2,500 anti-Asian hate crimes have been reported. When you see that statistic, how does that hit you?
I think that this has always been an issue in this country. It was definitely magnified and perhaps more reported during COVID, but Asian Americans have always held a complex place in US racial dynamics. We're invisible, we're the quote unquote model minority. We are the perpetual foreigner. And all of these conflicting forces often cause hate to either go misunderstood or underrepresented. And so I believe that perhaps now there's less attention on these crimes, maybe even less reporting, but they're still happening. And I believe that some of the rhetoric that's happening nationally about China, about immigrants, are affecting Asian Americans.
Let's talk about that and how the conversation, in your view, has evolved from 2021 and even before the Atlanta spa shootings. 2020 was a year of social reckoning in the United States. Widespread protests, the Black Lives Matter protest, later on the Stop Asian Hate protests. How has the conversation evolved, in your view, in the 5 years that have passed since 2021?
In many ways, it's difficult to imagine where we were at in 2021. It was so far removed from where we are now. And so, just to remind people, 2021 was not only the year of the protests that you mentioned, but also the year that many people formed book clubs to read about systemic racism, where corporations doubled down on DEI programs, promised to hire and do outreach to communities of color. This was the year when everybody, people and companies, blacked out their Instagram profiles to show support for Black Lives Matter. Communities reached out in solidarity with each other. Black Lives Matter protesters joined Stop Asian Hate protesters. I think we're far removed from that right now, as people well know that DEI is now a banned concept and word and programs in the federal government and far beyond. I think that many communities of color and immigrant communities are frankly just trying to survive and laying low. I think it's also important, as we looked at the far-reaching impact of ICE raids in many American cities, that immigrants of all nationalities and all races are being affected. In Minneapolis, Hmong refugees, who are considered part of the Asian American community, were one of the most detained and most harassed immigrant groups. And so when we talk about immigration crackdowns, Asian Americans are being affected too.
Let's end here. We've talked about where we were. We've talked about, in your view, where we have gone to get to the point where we are now, 5 years removed from the Atlanta spa shootings. Where does the conversation go next?
I think we have to come to a place of realism about the realities of race and systemic racism in the United States for all groups. And this sort of whitewashing, for lack of a better word, of the existence of racism and DEI is really hurting all communities. And so I would like to see more education and dialogue, an end to these book bans, and you don't have to call it DEI, but we have to talk about race and hate in America. It's very real, and the Asian American community has to be a part of that discussion.
Professor Angie Chuang, CU Boulder Associate Professor of Journalism. Professor, thank you for your time and your perspective.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here.